I'm Bill Jeffway. I'm the Executive Director of the Dutchess County Historical Society. I'm very glad to have you all here tonight. We're very lucky this month we have as a sponsor CR Properties. They've been a long-standing supporter of us, and sponsors like CR Properties allow us to bring these events at no charge to the public. And I want to introduce Dr. Mike Bowden is well known here as a board member, or active board member at the Historical Society. And he's a professor of history at Dutchess Community College. He's retired Army, so he knows what he's talking about when it comes to military. And he's a former assistant professor at West Point. And he's someone who really has not just an interest, but a deep passion and knowledge for the subject. So we feel very, very lucky and grateful to have him here. So I'm going to do nothing more than get out of the way and allow Mike Bowden to present to us on the Battle of Aversboro.
All right, thanks, Bill. I appreciate that very much. Hi, everybody. It is really great to see folks out there. I do want to start off with a few thank yous before we get going as well. First and foremost, Bill Jeffway, the director. It's amazing how much information is out there over all things historical here in Dutchess County, and the amount of help that I've received from Bill, and I'd also be remiss to say Melody Moore as well. The two Melody's in charge of the Society's collections. The amount of artifacts that they've been able to collect and share are just amazing and made my job a lot easier. I'd also like to thank, I don't know whether there's anybody here from down in Aversboro itself, but Benny Pierce is the staff historian down at Aversboro, and he has been very, very helpful to me in answering questions. The staff down there is incredibly friendly. I'd also like to thank probably the person in Dutchess County who knows the most and has probably forgotten more than most of us will ever know about the 150th, and that's Pete Bedrosian. Pete, along with Mike Peets, is one of the leaders of the 150th New York Volunteer Infantry Regiment Historical Association. All sorts of documents that they have collected, knowledge about the battle itself, and Pete's been a tremendous help for me answering some questions, some of which are probably very, very dumb, some of which are he's provided some incredible insight. So I've got to thank him for that. I do, as always, want to thank all of the members of the Historical Society, especially CR Properties, for being our sponsor for this presentation. Thank you so much, Tom. I appreciate that. We all do. And last, on a personal note, I really am so excited to see my dad, Jerry Bowden, and my aunt, Marcia Bowden, from Nebraska and California, respectively. I've been blessed with parental support since the day I decided I liked history. And they have been just an incredible part in what I'm doing, and I got to thank them for it. So with that said, let's talk about the Battle of Aversboro a little bit. And, Bill said Avery'sboro, I said Aversboro. This is a question I asked Pete. I've heard it pronounced both ways. We could also, it's got a bunch of other names. It's the Battle of Black River. So there's numerous different ways. I'm going to try to refer to it as Aversboro, which is what the American Battlefield Trust calls it. But if somebody has a question that says Aversboro, that's okay too. So you're not going to be looking at me a whole lot here. I'm going to go and start sharing some slides, and we will get going. And get this set up. There we go. Oh, last thing I need to do is get a laser pointer, which always helps. So the title, The Civil War Battle at Aversboro Through the Eyes of the Dutchess County Men Who Fought and Died There, specifically through the experiences of the 150th New York Volunteer Infantry Regiment, the Dutchess County Regiment. Now, Dutchess County men served in numerous regiments throughout the entire war. There's records of them serving in 20 of the 190 plus, at least, infantry regiments, as well as multiple artillery batteries and 4 to 5 different cavalry regiments. But the 150th is the only regiment that was specifically chartered to be solely of Dutchess County participants. All of the companies were made up of men from the county. The other regiment that was predominantly the county regiment, predominantly men of the county, was the 128th, though there were a couple of companies that were formed from Columbia County as well. So the 150th does have certain pride of place here in Dutchess County. Uh, and I want to kind of start with just a brief history of the 150th. You know, who were they? What did they do? What was their wartime service like? You know, so very briefly, the 150th was formed in the summer of, well, it was sanctioned in the summer of 1862. It actually stood up and was mustered in October of 1862 after President Lincoln called for an additional 300,000 three-year volunteers. So the unit was stood up to serve for 3 years. It spent most of the first 8 months on duty serving as garrison troops in Baltimore. But in June of 1863, Robert E. Lee decided that he was going to invade the North, and the 150th was pulled out of Baltimore and set up in a provisional brigade with two 30-day militia units coming out of Maryland. They fought in the Battle of Gettysburg, had a brief role to play on the second day, but primarily they are known for their fighting on the third day, where they held a chunk of Culp's Hill, including fighting back the final assault there by Richard Ewell's Confederate troops on the morning of the 3rd. Following that battle, they went out west along with the 12th Corps, where they served in security details during the Chattanooga campaign. In 1864, they fought in the entire Atlanta campaign, including pivotal roles in many battles: Resaca, Buzzard's Roost, Resaca, Dallas, Kolb's Farm. Once the siege of Atlanta was finished, they were assigned to be on Sherman's march to the sea. They marched to the sea, they arrived in Savannah, and from there they marched into the Carolinas in Sherman's final campaign. The last battle they fought in was AVERASBORO. They were commanded, and Bill has done, if you read the Northern and Southern Dutchess County News, Bill has written a really nice little article during the last edition about John Ketchum, the first colonel of the regiment. Well, he led the company, or excuse me, the regiment all the way until Savannah, where he was severely wounded, and the company was taken over by Lieutenant Colonel Alfred Smith. And he was the one who actually commanded the regiment as we get into the Carolinas campaign in AVERASBORO. So we're going to talk a little bit about Smith as the presentation develops. The other focus area here of the presentation is going to be on Company I of the Dutchess County Regiment. And there's a few reasons for that. Number one, we have a lot of documents from Company I. Richard Titus, who was the first lieutenant when it was raised in 1862. This is a poster specifically for Company I. Colonel John Ketchum is the commander of the regiment. Captain Broas was the commander of Company I. After Gettysburg, he became ill and was mustered out of the service. Titus became the company commander, and he left all of his papers after his death. Those eventually came down to the County Historical Society, which I'm trying to remember how many boxes, how many folios of original documents exist. I think about 5 or 6, some large flat folios, some smaller ones, but some incredible documents there. So we know a lot about Company I. We're also going to be talking a lot about this guy, David Slate, who was the second lieutenant of Company I when the unit was formed, would go on to be the first lieutenant. By the time we get to AVERASBORO, he is the company commander. Richard Titus took leave after Atlanta, went home to Poughkeepsie. By the time he was home and came back to Atlanta, Sherman's army had already marched to the sea, and Titus couldn't catch up. Slate was the commander of the company. And we're going to talk a little bit about him. Well, we're going to talk a lot about him as we go through the presentation. So the next question is, why am I then going to be talking about AVERASBORO? I've just given you the history of this regiment that fought in some of the toughest battles of the war. Gettysburg, the fighting going on around Atlanta. Why AVERASBORO? There's 5 reasons for that. And the first one, I'm going to point back again to an email exchange I had with Pete Bedrosian. And this would have been, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. I can't even remember right now, but I'd gone down to visit the Battle of Bentonville, which was the largest battle of Sherman's. And this is before I really knew a lot about the 150th. Well, the 150th didn't do much at Bentonville. They stood in reserve. The trenches they were in are still there, but they didn't do much. So, I talked to Pete, and Pete said, hey, you really need to check out AVERASBORO, because as the regimental history of the 150th says, it was the longest and in some respects the hardest engagement our regiment was ever in. That's a pretty bold statement. The hardest engagement our regiment was ever in. So that's one reason. The second reason are the conditions of this fight. This was just a miserable fight to be in, a miserable battle. And I'll talk more about why that was the case as we get into the specifics. The third reason has to do with the fact that I mentioned David Slate. He died in this battle. And his death had a profound impact on the participants. He was remembered and eulogized in a number of very striking ways that I think speak to the importance that this battle had in the memory of the men of the 150th. The fourth reason, and this is one that I'm going to give credit to somebody who I should have thanked also as well at the beginning, Andy Villani, who's the chair of the Society's Programs Committee, who's just done a phenomenal work putting these multiple programs together that you had the opportunity to see. We were talking, and I mentioned some of the things I mentioned during a discussion a few months back, and he says, well, you know, there really are no small battles. I'm like, you know, he's absolutely right. This is a battle that the total casualty count was somewhere around 12 to 1,300 soldiers combined between both the Confederates and the federal forces. That's a substantial number for a relatively small number of troops that were involved. This is not a small battle. And the final reason that I focus on AVERASBORO is for folks who want to visit a battlefield, this is a very, very easy one to visit. It's literally 2 miles off of I-95 in the middle of North Carolina. A perfect opportunity for a couple hours or maybe even an hour just to get off the interstate, stretch your legs, and see something where folks from Dutchess County participated and played a role in history. So with that said, just start off with a picture. This is, Colonel Alfred B. Smith. It says later general. He was promoted to general in the middle of 1865 for actions at AVERASBORO. He was a colonel at the time. He was the one who commanded the regiment. I want to take a quick look at the strategic overview. What's going on in the war? First of all, AVERASBORO itself. I just did a quick Google Maps snapshot. It's roughly in the middle of a triangle between Raleigh, Goldsboro, and Fayetteville. So strategically located. A few minutes ago, I talked about Bentonville, the biggest battle in the Carolinas. This gives you a sense of where that battle took place in that location. But strategically, we're in 1865. We're in the last few months of the war. We're in a situation where there's not, I don't want to say there's not much going on, but there's really two major campaigns. There's Lee and Grant at Petersburg, and then there's Sherman going through the Carolinas. There are other minor operations, but those are the big ones. And while it may seem from hindsight that the war is pretty much over, people didn't view it as such. Nobody in the Southern leadership really has the opinion that this war is going to be winnable, but there is the view that when Joseph Johnson, the Confederate commander for the Confederate forces in the Carolinas, when he took command in late February, he said that his purpose in life, his purpose here was to try to extend the war to attain the most possible fair terms of peace that he could achieve. So the South is still trying to do whatever they can to achieve some sort of peace. The North, yeah, they can see the war's almost there, but not quite. Too many bad things have happened. I want to share two comments from folks in the 150th as this campaign's getting ready to run. One of them is from, again, Lieutenant David Slate, who I've already mentioned a few times. On the 25th of January, right before the campaign starts, he wrote his brother back in Poughkeepsie, about LaGrangeville. There is considerable talk around now about peace, but I cannot see that it has any foundation, for it all comes from one side. The rebels show no more signs of coming to terms than heretofore. Also, a private in Company G, Jeremiah Collins, wrote a letter well after the fact. He wrote it as an older man, but reflecting on the days in March. And he said, the army as a whole felt that the close of the war was near, but they feared if Lee slipped away from Richmond and joined hands with Johnson, then it would be made hard for us. So there is still just that nagging skepticism that the war is not quite over with. So taking it from that strategic picture down to the operational, what is Sherman doing? Just a quick map here showing this is the general direction that Sherman went. He left Savannah on the 1st of February, marching through the Carolinas, reached Columbia on the 17th of February, marching to Fayetteville, North Carolina, reaching Fayetteville on the 11th of March. Nobody's really sure, well, on the Confederate side, what he's doing. Is he going to shoot for Goldsboro and try to get out to sea and then go aid Grant? Is he going to try to get the capital at Raleigh? Is he going to try to march straight up to Petersburg? What's he going to do? In order to try to determine this, Joseph Johnson, the long-standing Confederate general, defensive expert, is put in charge of the defenses of the Carolinas. And he's trying to bring together 4 different forces to combat Sherman. Sherman has about 60,000 men, well-trained, experienced. They have a history of victory. You can consider them perhaps the best army at this stage in the war that's out there. Whereas Johnson has kind of a ragtag collection. He's got the forces of William Hardee, who has fought in the West for most of the war, commands troops in South Carolina, who's trying to retreat in front of Sherman. At the start of February, Hardee has about 1,300 soldiers. By the time we get to the 11th of March at Fayetteville, he has about half of that, about 6,500. Braxton Bragg, perhaps the least capable general in American history, commands the forces of coastal Carolina, Wilmington, Fort Fisher, the Cape Hatteras area. He is bringing the troops that he has back to Goldsboro to try to link up with Johnson as well. He has about the same number of troops, maybe 6,000 to 8,000 men. Lieutenant General A.P. Stewart is bringing the remains of the Confederate Army of Tennessee. This is the main Confederate army in the West that has just been devastated by the fights around Atlanta and most recently the battles of Franklin and Nashville, which wreck it as an army. Stewart is bringing as many men as he can to Johnson, which is only amounting to maybe 5,000 men of an army that, the veterans of Chickamauga, the veterans of Stones River, many veterans of Shiloh. That's about all that can be gathered. And finally, perhaps the only force that is comparable with what Sherman has, the cavalry. Wade Hampton, Joe Wheeler, together between them have about 8,000 cavalrymen, many of them sent down from the Army of Northern Virginia because heck, Lee doesn't have much use for cavalry in the trench lines. They are about even in number, about 6,000 to 8,000 with what Sherman has. And they are delaying him the entire time. Johnson is trying to get everybody together in the location depicted there with the icon to maybe try to hit one of the flanks of Sherman. So this is the situation. And why it's important is because it frames what Johnson is trying to do. When Sherman enters Fayetteville on the 11th of March, Johnson gives Hardee the mission of, with whatever troops you have, we need to hold off Sherman as long as possible so I can get these other troops up together that we can put up some sort of a defense. Delay him, see if you can find out what direction he's going. That's what Johnson is trying to do. He gives William Hardee the mission of doing that. And Sherman is a little bit nervous. He's getting ready to march out of Fayetteville. What Sherman is going to try to do is use one half of his army, the left wing under John Slocum, the 20th Corps, which is where the 150th is with, to feint toward Raleigh and then move to Goldsboro. Sherman gives the 20th Corps the mission of feinting, move up towards Aversboro. When you get to the road between Raleigh and Goldsboro, head to Goldsboro. Sherman is still a little bit nervous. I can whip Joe Johnson provided he doesn't catch one of my corps in the flank. And I will see that my army marches to Goldsboro in compact form. Johnson is trying to do the other. He's going to try to, he's not going to give battle to Sherman, but it can if he finds it divided. And by the time we get to Aversboro, we do find Sherman's army divided. We find it divided again at Bentonville a few days later, but Aversboro is where we're going to focus on. So on the 11th of May, Slocum's Corps, the 20th Corps, marches out of Fayetteville. Slocum has divided his Army Corps into two different halves. One of the halves, two divisions, is in what's called the Light Division, which minimal wagons, minimal rucks, every man as light as possible. Jackson's 1st Division is one of those light divisions. Hawley's brigade, William Hawley's brigade, is the lead brigade in that division, and the 150th is a member of Hawley's brigade. So the 150th is one of the first regiments to march out of Fayetteville on the 11th of March, marching to the north. They actually cross the Cape Fear River, marching to the north on the night of the 13th, and then they sit on the 14th because they're waiting for the rest of the Army Corps to get across. Which brings us to the morning of the 15th. Oh, I didn't want to quite go there yet. I'm sorry. So on the morning of the 15th, Hardee has decided he is going to set up his line in three sequential defensive lines. He's got a mixture of troops between very, very inexperienced garrison troops for much of the war and some that are incredibly experienced. One of the brigades that he has with him is, if anybody's familiar with the war in the Army of Northern Virginia, Joseph Kershaw's old South Carolina brigade that was sent down from Virginia, one of the most experienced brigades in any army. And he's got them in reserve. And he has established a line just south of AVERASBORO where he's between the Cape Fear River and the Black River. It's about a 2 to 3 mile gap. He's able to establish a series of 3 defensive lines, and he's going to try to at least determine what Sherman is doing there. Sherman marches forward, sends his troops forward to develop the situation. He's sending cavalry forward, and the cavalry under General Judson Kilpatrick, who is a character in and of himself, they can do a little bit of a scrape on the night of the 15th and have to call back and ask for help from the infantry. And that's where our story with the 150th really begins, the night before the battle on the 15th. And I'm going to use the words of some of the Dutchess County participants to describe what the original stages of the battle was like, or what that original framework was like. First of all, the diary of Peter Funk from Company F. I want to meet this guy. The cemetery where he's buried in the Union Cemetery in Hyde Park. Thank you, Melody. You were correct on that. He's buried in the Union Cemetery at Hyde Park. He wrote a diary. We don't have the original diary. We have records that it was sold to an individual collector at some point in the past, but we do know that the diary was published in serial form in the Red Hook Advertiser in 1932, and that's what you see on the right. One of the between the months of May and August, in serial form, his diary was published. And Funk has a way with words. He is very eloquent and somewhat funny about some of the things he writes in a way that not a lot of diaries are. And Peter Funk talks about the march to support the cavalry on the 15th. On March 15th, 1865, we had marched through the rain most of the day and went into camp at night, tired and wet to the hide. We put up our tents and had our fire blazing and began to think ourselves quite comfortable when the shrill notes of our brigade and division bugles broke the stillness of camp, and the cry of the 150th fall in brought tents down quicker than they went in. So think about this, and this gets back to my point about the conditions of the fight. This is March in North Carolina. So average daytime highs are around 60, nighttime lows, low 40s. It is rained all day long. These guys have been marching through mud. Now, I'm guessing it wasn't close to 60 degrees. It was probably some of that just miserable rain, 40 degrees, steady, you're getting soaked to the bone, and all you want to do is just dry out and get ready for the next day. You've been marching across the Carolinas. You thought you were going to have a couple days in Fayetteville. But no, you had basically a day. And now you're back at it in the rain and the mud, and you just get comfortable. And then, oh, hey, everybody fall in. The cavalry needs your help. Think about what those guys were experiencing. They had to be just miserable. Now, where they were at when this broke out was a place called the Old Bluff Church. Colonel Smith calls it Longstreet's Church. I really don't know why, but the Old Bluff Church. And other comments note about how the soldiers, the 150th, were bedded down within the tombstones. And you can see the original tombstones, or the older tombstones, are located back in this part of the cemetery. This is where they were at, and they were getting ready to rest. And all of a sudden, they got the word they needed to march, and they marched. It's underneath that thing. I can't quite read it, but I do have. Excuse me 1 minute here. The joys of digging through a lot of notes. That top quote was written in a speech after the war in 1866 by Brevet Major General J. Watts de Peyster, who went on to be the Adjutant General of New York. Wading through mud up to the armpits, some of the boys going all under. The 150th reached Kilpatrick about midnight and went into action at daylight. The 150th fought all day in the rain and drove the enemy 2 miles, is the next statement. Slocum's report, official report, Hawley's brigade was sent forward late in the evening to support the cavalry. The roads were almost impassable. So the soldiers of the 150th are marching in the rain on these mud-covered roads, a singular mud-covered road up to the battlefield. They are soaked to the bone. They are muddy. They are miserable. They arrive somewhere in this vicinity right here, about 4 hours after they started. Colonel Smith's official report says they arrived at 11 p.m. His diary says they arrived at midnight. Most people say he arrived at midnight. So you look at the location, and this is just, I forgive the picture a little bit. I do like the map. It's a picture I took down from the AVERASBORO Visitor Center. So you've got the 150th. They arrive up to back up the cavalry. It's midnight. It's raining. They're still cold, wet, and miserable, except now the difference is you've got the enemy right in front of you. So there's not going to be any fires. You're going to have pickets out. You're going to have to be on your toes and get ready to fight at daylight on the next day. And daylight was about 6:30 in the morning. So they are getting up early. Think about how tired and miserable these cats are. And very quickly, this picture is, these would have been the fields in which the 150th would have been camped out, at least some of them. This part of this side of the road and the other side of the road. This road right here we're going to come back to is North Carolina Route 82. At the time, it was the Raleigh Plank Road. It was the main road. It was the only real trafficable road in the area. And they would have camped there overnight and gotten up first thing in the morning in order to go into battle. Now, this map is from the American Battlefield Trust. I really like it because it does show the 150th position, but it shows the position about 10:30 in the morning. What it doesn't show is that the 150th started here. That's where they were at from about midnight on the 15th to about the 16th. And until about 10:30 in the morning, Hawley's brigade was the only brigade on the field. You know, Hawley's brigade, who in this graphic is located here, 5 regiments, that's it. The 150th is in line from 6:30 in the morning, and they're the only ones there. By 10:30 in the morning, other troops have arrived, and the Union is able to conduct an attack. Sherman's troops are able to conduct an attack that basically flanks the Confederate first line and drives them away. The 150th is in the forefront. They approximately advanced from 6:30 in the morning to 10:30 in the morning, where I've just shown. And then starting at 10:30, they advanced to the Confederate second line, which is located just off the screen to the north. So they're fighting all day long. We get to that second line. Oh, real quick, I'm sorry. I'm jumping ahead of myself. See here, I get going, I get ahead of myself and I forget things. just to give you an idea of the terrain over which they would have marched, a little bit of an idea about what it looks like. The next slide is going to have two pictures. The first picture is going to be taken from approximately this location, which is on the Raleigh Plank Road, looking to the northeast, the fields across which the 150th would have attacked. And just off the screen here to the north, the second picture is going to be looking from the Confederate second line back in the direction they would have attacked. So those give an idea of the terrain. Now, it's not going to be exactly the same, but there's a few things to notice. First of all, it's very flat. There's not much terrain here. And I'm going to talk about that when we get to the attack on the third line. There's a little bit more terrain than you'd think, but there's not, it's fairly flat, fairly open, you can see. There would not have been any crops coming up, but the thing that would have been accurate is the sky. The day I visited AVERASBORO, and Mickey and Nina at the visitor center down there said, well, you're getting exactly what the soldiers got when they were here. It poured all day long. So you get an idea of the weather conditions, rainy and miserable. And the other thing to note from this position is the William Smith House. This is a contemporary drawing that was published in Harper's Weekly shortly after the battle. Here it's listed as the Battle of Black River. Before the name of AVERASBORO stuck, it was the Battle of Black River. This cabin is supposed to represent this house. And it's the John Smith home. It was used as a hospital for the Confederates first, and then when they evacuated, it became the hospital for the 20th Corps. It is where the wounded from the 150th would have been brought. The only thing that's kind of goofy about this picture is if you look at it, well, two things about it. First of all, the John Smith house in this picture is on the left-hand side of the road. Here it's on the right-hand side. The original house was moved from its original position on the left-hand side here to the other side of the road about 5 or 6 years ago. So this is not the original position of the house. It is the original house. You can still see bullet holes in this house from the battle. And the ground that the 150th would have attacked upon would have been this field out here on the far side of the house. Also, you notice there's a lot more trees in this picture. At the time of the battle, it was more wooded. It wasn't woody in the sense that you were fighting in a forest, but there were more trees than we see now. Just something to keep in mind. For the final phase of the battle, and again, this shows a picture later in the afternoon. Up until 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the 150th remained on the front of the line. It was not until 4 o'clock in the afternoon that Hobart's brigade of the 14th Corps, another corps coming onto the scene, arrived and moved in front of them. And the 150th during this stage of the battle, these two graphics here are from the previous slide where they attacked in the picture, just for a reference point. From this point, they continued the advance, pushing further to the right and then further ahead until they were overtaken by Hobart. Now, during the entire scope of the battle, the 150th was involved in skirmishing the entire day long. There was never any headlong assault on the Confederate lines, but skirmishing is an activity that is, it's not a simple matter of, 30 minutes of just abstract horror and violence. It is a situation where you are constantly probing the enemy, having to be on your toes the entire time, making sure that you have identified where the enemy is at, how strong he is, when's he going to attack, when's he going to fall back. And the 150th has been doing this all day long. This is mentally tough, as well as the fact that, you're getting shot at for 8 hours straight, maybe not by continuous massive volleys, but you are being shot at continually. Not only is it physically demanding, it is mentally demanding. You add that into the weather conditions, the ground conditions, this has got to be a tough fight. And as I mentioned, they are on the front line for 8 hours after a really rough night in the rain. The next picture I have is taken from where they crossed the road, where they crossed the Confederate second line and advanced to the north. I've got two pictures, both one looking north, one looking northwest. And And the reason I show these pictures, this is kind of the final direction of attack of the 150th. In the distance, this is the AVERASBORO Visitor Center. You can see the little white building off in the distance. When the attack went in from the 150th, the final attack before they were taken over, they were basically advancing in this direction, just to the left side of these trees out here. And it was at this stage, at the very end, that Lieutenant Slate was shot. And one of the, I mentioned how flat everything was. One of the things that's a little bit deceiving about this landscape is that there are gentle folds in the land, things that we cannot see from these photographs, and they're very difficult to see when standing on the ground. But as you march forward, they're going to be enough that you're going to be able to hide soldiers behind them. They may be 5 or 6 feet difference over the course of multiple hundreds of yards. And that's enough that, we have anecdotal reports that when the 150th got up to the 3rd Confederate line, they were very surprised. They got up to the line and they kind of came over one of these gentle rises. And it was at that point that Lieutenant Slate was shot while leading his company. But again, once, the battle sort of ended at that point for the 150th when Hobart came around them and assaulted the Confederate 3rd line. By this time in the day, it is pouring cats and dogs again. It is the heaviest rain of the day. The Union cannot make any headway, and they call off the attacks. So Hardee has held for a day. At night, he realizes he's not going to be able to hold out in the morning, and he retreats. But in terms of general outcome of the battle itself, they kind of did what they had to do. The Confederates held the Union for a day. They held Sherman back a day. And that day was enough that allowed Johnson to get some troops together. Hardee also gave his troops a little bit of experience under fire. They were able to say, hey, we're outnumbered, but we did it for a day. We did it. We can do this. We got a shot. So it was probably more of a benefit for the Confederates than the Union. In the big scheme of things, this didn't really affect Sherman's plans. He now had a lot of wounded that he needed to carry along with him, somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 soldiers. That was really difficult. That was a strain on these light divisions' logistical support, their ambulance corps. But it didn't change his movements. It delayed him for a day. That was it. Let's talk a little bit more about the 150th. One of the things that just really I found very striking. I found a letter, and I can't claim credit for this letter. I believe the original is with Pete Bedrosian's organization, the 150th New York Historical Association, but from a soldier in Company F. Again, Company F, that had to be a great company to be a part of, who wrote a letter back home. This is a young man, Thomas Palmier, who is from Red Hook. And, he wrote a letter, and I see it's hidden behind my screen. But he does say, at AVERASBORO, myself and a stickle, and that's all he says, a stickle from this organization, or from this place, Upper Red Hook, were the first to cross the enemy's fortifications, collecting there some trophies, which we brought home. So I'm trying to track down, what stickle? Well, there are 3 stickles on the roster for Company F. All 3 of their last names are spelled different. Stickle, which is Oscar Stickle, who is buried in Red Hook at the St. Paul's Lutheran Cemetery. In the Rhinebeck Cemetery, you have a second of the Stickles, William Stickles, Stickles. And then there's a private Stickle who is listed as enlisting from Red Hook, who spelled his last name Stickell. Just one of those little stories that, who were these guys? Which Stickle is the one that Palmier is talking about? What trophies? Where are they? But this was a battle that people were writing about. They were writing home about. They were excited about. This meant something to the members of the 150th. But there were costs. There were casualties. This slide shows on the left It shows the very long eulogy written, this is in the Poughkeepsie Eagle on the 5th of May, written by a WRW. I'm assuming that's William Wallen. I will show you his picture on the next slide. And on the right, it lists the casualty lists. And there are, I could talk for another 15 minutes about the casualty list because there's a lot of casualties out there, casualty lists out there, and not all of them agree. This is the one that Colonel Smith sent back and was published in the paper that lists Lieutenant Slate killed. The other death in the unit was Private John Cass, who was wounded on the 16th, died at the hospital, the John Smith house that I showed you, the following day, and then 17 other wounded men. Most of the other reports talk about another officer being wounded in the battle. Smith's official report says there was another officer wounded. And I believe that was William Wadels, who was originally with Company A of the 150th, but at the time of the battle was serving as the brigade commander's aide-de-camp. And he was, again, this is from Hawley's, the brigade commander's official report of the battle, slightly wounded in the breast. So a couple things about David Slate. He's buried in Poughkeepsie. He's buried at the LaGrange Rural Cemetery. Very prominent gravestone. If you're on Overlook Road, as you're going between 55 and 44, the cemetery's right there on the west side of the road. And his marker is prominent. It's toward Overlook Road. You can't miss it as you drive by. And as it can show, he fought at Gettysburg, Atlanta, Savannah, and AVERASBORO. The other death, John Cass, as I mentioned, he was mortally wounded. He's buried at the Raleigh National Military Cemetery in Raleigh, North Carolina. That's his headstone. The loss of Slate meant something to this unit. And I've got a couple statements here. I'm not going to read all of these, but I want to highlight two things. The first one is one of the key points that is repeated throughout all of these comments. It killed leading his company in almost the last battle of the war, in which his regiment was entered, and one of the very last bullets that was fired struck him. Killed in the battle, leading his company in, as one might say, the last fight of the war. And he was fought at the 11th hour of this battle, in right around 4 o'clock. He was shot in the lower stomach, and he was carried from the field. He gave some directions about his personal belongings. He gave some directions to the company, and he had died by the time he reached the hospital. This death, so close to the end of the war, meant something to these people. And the other one, though, that really strikes me is Colonel Smith's diary, not his official report, but Smith's diary is it's almost bulletized. But when you read it, you can see that he's almost numb about losing Lieutenant Slate. Slate killed, heavy fire. Then he says it again, Lieutenant Slate killed. He has 3 little bullet points about carrying the earthworks, which direction the company went. And then we all mourn the loss of Lieutenant Slate. You can feel through the words Smith trying to rationalize the death of this lieutenant that's been with the regiment from the very beginning. Now, I'm getting close to the end, both on time and in terms of my slide, but a couple things I do want to point out. This is Captain Richard Titus, the one who gave us the papers. I have one final kind of example to talk about the significance of this battle. And that is simply some of the documents that in the Titus collection. What I've got here is, this is the original document, the abstract and materials that were expended by Company I. This is only for Company I. It's not for the whole regiment, but it is indicative of what a typical company would have experienced. And it shows at the Battle of Gettysburg on July the 3rd that Company I expended 1,840 bullets. The fight on Culp's Hill at Gettysburg, 1,840 bullets. Well, if I extrapolate a little bit, and I don't have exact numbers for how many people were in Company I at Gettysburg, but if I look at some of the roster strengths listed between November of 1862 and October of 1863, there's a rough average that puts it in the upper 60s. I don't know whether you can see behind it, says ration strength, about 68 men, which means that the average average soldier would have expended about 27 rounds at the Battle of Culp's Hill. Well, now we go to, here's the personnel document that shows 82 men, 14 absent, and where they were all at, just as an idea of some of these documents. Here's the same documents for AVERASBORO, 1,300 rounds. But the strength of the company is much lower. Again, using the same sort of methodology, I have the numbers for the 31st of March. And if you extrapolate everything out, the ration strength seems to be about 49 men. And if you take the ammo expenditure and the number of men that were in the regiment, they're expending 26.5 rounds. In other words, at the Battle of AVERASBORO, they're firing the same amount of rounds as they did at Gettysburg. And if we're looking at the sense of the degree to which this battle was intense, that is one indicator of the intensity that the 150th went through. I think that's just a very interesting, not only comparison, but also an indicator of some of the artifacts that Bill and Melody have so diligently worked to collect at the Historical Society. Also on some of these reports, this is the one for March of '65. And you can see that it does show that David Slate, now where's my laser pointer, was killed in action on March 16th, 1864. This is Captain Broes's that was passed on to Titus, that was passed on to Slate. The daily morning reports, again, indicates him killed. And you can't see it on this document, but one of the things that's very poignant is that the commander has to sign these documents, these signatures over here to the right. And up until the 11th of March, that's all David Slate's. And he was killed 4 days later. And after that, the entry is blank until the very end of the month. The Historical Society also has Lieutenant Slate's ledger book, which is full of a lot of mundane points about ration strength and ammunition and knapsacks and how many bayonet scabbards were broken. But again, it's another indicator of the humanity that many of these soldiers had to live through, the mundaneness of ordinary garrison life, if you will. Just a fascinating document to flip through. Very quickly, I've got 5 more slides, and I'm going to go through them very quickly because in a situation like this, it's tough to really look at. But AVERASBORO is a very easy battle to visit. And if you visit it, there's really 5 stops to take. And I should also preface this, that I'm going to put this into an article for the Dutchess County Historical Society's annual yearbook, where I will explain these. So, you know, if you have that yearbook, you'll be able to look and see where to go on these visits. Again, just an idea here. This is I-60, the I-95, scale of 2 miles. So it's just right off the interstate, exit 61, 65, and this exit up here is 71. The summer was kind of a mess because there was a lot of construction going on, but it's still very easy. The first stop is the old Bluff Church, which I've already talked about, you know, where the 150th began the night on the 15th. The second stop, there's a little wayside area. You can see the parking area here. That's located where the 150th, the area in which they would have bivouacked on the night of the 150th, on the night of the 15th, where wet, rainy, miserable, sort of like the picture you can see, getting ready to go into battle the next morning. At the site of the first Confederate line, there is another wayside area that has some historical markers, as well as a memorial to the 20th Corps that includes the 150th New York. And then continuing up, all of these are right on 82, which is the old Raleigh Plank Road. The Chicora Cemetery, which is located at the Confederate Third Line. It's the burial site for a number of Confederate soldiers who died in the battle, has numerous monuments and historical markers. There's an old slave cabin has been relocated to the site. There's a lot of interesting artifacts and markers at this site. And then the final visit, and if you want to make it the first you can, is the AVERASBORO Battlefield Museum and Visitor Center. Holy smokes, it's small, but there's a lot of stuff there. Not only about the battle itself, but about North Carolina in the Civil War. It's staffed by volunteers. And when I was there, as I've mentioned a couple times, Mickey and Nina, incredibly friendly, incredibly helpful, gave me some excellent tips, walked me through some of the exhibits. Couldn't have asked for a warmer reception and more help. So I've got nothing but positive things to say about this visitor center. If you get a chance, it's a great little place to go. Now, I've tried to go through a very, a battle that has a lot of facets fairly quickly, probably maybe not as quickly as some of you would have liked, sorry.
So thank you, Mike and CR Properties and all of you for joining us, and we will see you anon and online.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. It's so great to see everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mike. Great
Thank you.
presentation.
Thanks, Mike. Great job.
Hey, you bet. Thanks, Roy. Great to see you. Say hi to
Good to
Tank.
see you. Well, awesome job. Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.